Welcome everyone. So we're just waiting for another 20 seconds to make sure everyone can join the meeting. So if you just joined the meeting, we are still waiting for a couple seconds. Make sure all the participants can join the meeting. All right. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining today's webinar, 5 Questions with Professor Teboho Moja, hosted by the NYU Alumni Association Alumni Club here in the Netherlands. This session is being recorded. All attendees are muted. But we invite you to type any questions into Q&A box, and we will leave time for Q&A at the end of the session. We will send a post-event survey, and I would be appreciated if you can fill it out after the event. My name is Tim Zhang, and I am an NYU Steinhardt alum, graduated in 2018 with master's degree in higher education student affairs. I moved to Netherlands in August 2019, last year. I am starting my own startup company here in Amsterdam, helping highly educated persons relocate to the Netherlands through Dutch orientation year visa, and providing a first month orientation program to help them quickly adapt to the local system, Dutch culture, and comply with regulations.
Hi everyone, my name is Ariel Tan, and I'm also an NYU Steinhardt alum as well, but from class 2019. Similar to Tim, I have a master's degree in higher education student affairs. I'm currently an area coordinator for California State University Long Beach Residential Life Team. As an immigrant myself, I'm interested in learning more about the impact of globalization and cultural integration. So today's program features Professor Teboho Moja, who will discuss the impact of COVID-19 on internationalization in higher education. Professor Moja, clinical professor of higher education at NYU Steinhardt, has authored articles on higher education reform issues in areas such as the governance of higher education, policy processes, and impact of globalization on higher education. She's a co-author of a book on educational changes in South Africa since the first democratic elections in 1994. Her teaching experience includes high school and university levels. So Professor Moja, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Ariel and Tim, and good morning, good day, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are in the world. So I'm really happy to be here and have this conversation with you. Thank you.
Awesome. So before we start a webinar, we want to acknowledge that with the current pandemic and George Floyd's incident, there are lots of overwhelming emotions and frustrations that many people are going through. As educators, we strive to recognize the impact of systematic power struggles and motivate positive changes for our students and communities at large. So we want to encourage people to educate themselves and show solidarity for those who are in need.
2 days ago, NYU's President Andrew Hamilton sent a message to NYU community. So he stated, I was quoting part of his message, "My heart goes out to those in our own community who have been feeling overwhelmed by the grief or apprehension because of the fears of their own safety, their family, and the loved ones. I wanted to remind you that NYU stands with you, and we have resources to help for students at the Wellness Exchange and for employees through CareBridge. And please also note that the Office of Global Inclusion continues to plan events for the community. You can find the full statements at the NYU website."
So without further ado, I'll start with the first question. So Professor Moja, with your international background and expertise, what are some fundamental differences between how institutions from different regions manage the COVID-19 differently from the US? What are some contributing factors?
The world is different. That is why the differences in the way institutions have actually responded. And let me start with the contributing factors first. And having said that the world is different, we're operating higher education in different contexts, economically and politically, and how systems of higher education are being governed and funded. We have national systems that have shown national responses to COVID, and we have federal systems as we have in the US. And with the federal systems, we have institutions that have got strong autonomy that requires direct institutional responses or so. So that's the major difference in terms of how different places have responded or so. So with the systemic responses where the system of education is a national system, we have seen some like India, South Africa, China, etc. Those are some of the countries that have got a national system of higher education. One of the things they did immediately was to close the institutions by instruction from their governments. It wasn't individual institutions saying we are ready to close the institution or so. So it was a systemic response. They were instructed to close the institutions. And with that, they went on to start working immediately on changing the academic calendar, delaying exams, and so on. So we have seen different responses where some are extending the academic year into the following year, taking away maybe like the winter break or taking away the summer break, depending on where they are or so. That was one response where academic calendars were changed. Another response that was different that I saw was that institutions started talking about a phased-in return of students, which I haven't heard much of in the US, because I hear more of like saying, let's all come back, or we will be back in fall in different modes, virtual, hybrid, or whatever. So in the other countries that I've seen the return of students starting, and they've started mainly in Africa, where I have seen that saying, okay, let's prioritize which students are coming back first. And they've started with final year students, with students in practical courses, and are working with a formula of saying in the first phase of returning to institutions, they will only take about 33% of the student population. Then in the second phase, take another, make it 66%, and finally reach the 100%. And this is the model South Africa is using. Some have variations of that. Another point that I've seen being different is how equity issues are being addressed in those systems, and how the institutions are gearing themselves to put together support programs upon the return of students who missed out. Because unlike in the US, where with advancement in technology or so, there were still problems in people really accessing technology, accessing virtual classes or so. But when we are looking at the developing nations, we have major, major issues in access. There were students where it was a complete shutdown, nothing, they didn't have computers. If they have computers, they don't have the internet or so. So even though some classes started happening or taking place, there were students that missed out altogether. So institutions are made to recognize that and put together programs for them. In some instances, they're even using funds like student financial aid to purchase or to let students purchase the equipment they need, pay for the internet if they have or so. What I found impressive was that by accident or so, not by plan, it seems that some countries were already ready for the pandemic. They were not ready because they were planning for the pandemic. They were ready because they were just planning for other issues that they deal with on a day-to-day basis. I'll give an example of some of the national initiatives that kicked in. India is one of those. They have something that they call SWAYAM, SWAYAM, which is a study web of active learning for young aspiring minds. It's similar to MOOC, and it's a government-initiated program. So with the pandemic, they immediately jumped onto that to use that for greater access, for making sure students can still access some of the courses or so. because on that system, they just have a whole lot of lessons and courses that people take for free as a system already to address access, equity, and quality issues for people that never access higher education or so, and the qualifications are recognized by government. For South Africa, it was more of being ready at an institutional level. South Africa in 2015 faced major protest that the system shut down completely. There was a movement called #FeesMustFall. Students protesting, banning buildings, classes, bringing everything to a standstill because they had had enough that the fees are just too high for them. They cannot afford that. They tagged on another movement called #Rhodes-Must-Fall, which was a movement for demanding that institutions decolonize, remove colonial figures, statues on that building or so. So because of that crisis that the system was in and was shut down, institutions set up online learning and set up hybrid learning modes. So for them, when responding to this, they already had a system that they were using it on and off. So it was much easier for them to really go into that. A few more points that I'll just point out to in terms of how other institutions have responded. We shouldn't forget graduating students. What did people do for graduating students? They're all anxious, they're not sure what to do or so. And what I've observed, I've seen how rich countries and not so rich countries have really responded to the needs of graduating students. Take Hong Kong, Singapore, Japan as examples of the rich countries. The universities themselves started creating jobs and internships opportunities that were supported by government funds because these are national systems to actually hire the graduating students in some of the areas and give them chance to really sort of hone in on their skills and not just go sit at home because the economy is not really doing well. So that worked well. Then you have other governments that are not so rich. India as an example. What the government did there was to call for institutions to actually set up special recruitment campaigns that would be used for helping students search for jobs or so. And they have a governing body called University Grants Council, which also went as far as providing guidelines for remote internships, remote jobs while in lockdown. Like, this is how you can help the students or so. And this has been done at national level. The last example, so we can move to other questions, is Sri Lanka that I want to use in this case, where government used the government employment scheme funds to pay unemployed graduates for them to get training for new roles like controlling and tracking COVID or so. So the creative ways that governments and institutions have worked hand in hand to really respond to that, which makes it different from a system that's much more federal with a lot of autonomy for the institutions.
Thank you, Professor Moja. So I think I definitely totally agree with a lot of things you mentioned earlier is talking about graduating students. They are really challenging, go through a lot of challenging like time right now, specifically talking about how institution can support them, how could international students, how could the institution support them as well. So that also kind of relates to my next question. With you, you have a lot of experience in terms of doing globalization work in the education setting. With university doing online class right now, and some class could be done visually, and students are doing long distance learning. So what are your thoughts on internationalization through this kind of visual learning, and how could students gain a global perspective?
Yeah, what we know is that we're going to have a new normal for internationalization. So it's not going to be the same business as usual or so, But at the same time, I'm sort of encouraged, and I was thrilled to start realizing and learning that there are actually some programs that are already implementing internationalization without mobility, and doing something similar to what would be a study abroad, but in a different way or so. And the examples that I saw for this was University of Washington in Bothell. They have a program, also SUNY patches. They have a program that they call COIL. It's Collaborative Online International Learning. That programs were targeting mainly online students. Like, how do you provide internationalization for online students? So that serves as one of the models that it is possible. That program seems to be popular. It's a new way of doing things that those students can participate in internationalizations. And without going into details as to how they're doing it, but it's more like models where they have collaborators, like they say, collaborative online learning, also pairing with another institution across the sea in a place that are targeting and working out ways to sort of like study collaboratively with people in another place. So that opens up access for students that normally wouldn't have been able to travel. We know most of online students are part-time, they're studying part-time, so it is different. Then there is what has always been there, internationalization at home. It's not new, but it will certainly gain momentum, maybe temporarily, maybe forever. We don't know whether this landscapes change forever or so. So there is that as an option that we could have that. And what I've seen outside the US also that countries are doing is gearing themselves towards becoming regional hubs because of proximity. So if India becomes a regional hub, they can have international students from the neighboring Asian countries come there. They're not too far from home. God forbid we shouldn't have another pandemic or crisis that makes people have to rush home or so, but at least they're not that far, they're within or so. So something much more comfortable where people are in close proximity. So the jury is out there to see and what will happen, but it's also exciting in giving us an opportunity to rethink what we have been doing and how we can do it well.
Awesome, thank you so much. So you kind of mentioned this in the first question regarding equity issues, and working in Res Life, I definitely see how different student populations has been disproportionately affected as a result of the pandemic, along with the range of different social issues. So my next question is about equity and equality for different populations. What are some commonly overlooked topics or populations within the higher educations that have been impacted by COVID-19?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I mean, it is a long list again, but I'll just touch on a few points that many populations that have been sort of either overlooked or not really getting much attention or so. I think one that jumps out for me first is the fate of the international students, what is going to be happening to them, that being impacted besides being unable to return to their institutions or so. Is there some way of thinking about delaying the start in some ways, creatively letting them start while they're still somewhere in their own home countries? Because there are many other obstacles for them to really start immediately. So for them, it cannot be business as usual. They're still keen to come complete. And I'm talking now about students who are already studying, not necessarily students that have the intention to study abroad or to come to the US as an example. Then Another population I can think of are students with disabilities, as an example. Are there programs that are targeting challenges that they face that are COVID related? We are catering for them under normal circumstances, but are there others that have been brought about as additional challenges that are related to COVID? I don't know much about that. I haven't seen much on that, but maybe institutions are communicating directly with students on that, and with tons of emails and communication that's going around. They don't want to overwhelm everybody with that, but accommodations and all that for those students is another one. Then the other sort of economic impact issues, where internships have been affected, work visas after studies have been affected in some ways or so. So what are those students going to do? The OTPs are expiring, they're rolling, and so on. How do we cater for them? How can we make them still maximize that time in during this time? Two more of the undergrads that might be missing on what we value, especially in higher education and student affairs: college experience. It's not the same online. So how can we really give them that college experience that they're missing out on, which we know impacts their development? They're still young, they're developing. We know all those student development theories, and we know that they're unfolding in a particular environment that we cannot replicate on online teaching or so. Then the impacts that are general, that are for sort of systems, like Australia and the UK in particular. For me, the major impact for them is income that they usually get from international students. You know, those are two systems that rely a lot on the fees that are paid by international students, and obviously they're going to be impacted by that. So there's impact from different angles, for populations, for institutions, for systems overall.
Thank you, Professor. So I think you mentioned a lot about international students. They experience a lot of things going on with a visa, OPT. I think one of the major issue, I think a lot of people working in the university right now currently experience, not only in the US, but also in other countries, is with the incoming international students for this fall semester. Most of the countries' embassies, they are not even working because of COVID-19. So my next question is, what are long-term impact of the COVID-19 and its related policies, and including US for Trump's immigration statement on international students interested in studying in the US?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I just read some articles that have been looking at what students are thinking, and some surveys that have been conducted. One of them conducted with Indian students in particular. We know that India and China are the biggest senders of students or so. And with the sample that was taken, the survey indicated that students are rethinking their study abroad ideas, or some are actually delaying their plans. They feel they might just want to wait a semester or so, because it has become difficult even just to get an appointment to go for a visa or so. The travel bans are impacting them. Consulates are closed because of the pandemic. There are long waiting lists for appointments that impact students. If you get an appointment for a visa that's in the middle of September or end of September, what does that mean in terms of being in time to start your program or so? So there are students that are really planning to defer their studies. I mentioned surveys, another one that was general, that was not in India only. In April, the OS survey indicated that actually as high as 63% of students are planning to defer their studies by either a semester or a year. And with that, a lot can actually happen in that deferment for a semester or a year. You find an alternative home, place that you feel you can continue with your studies, because by deferring, you're not just going to sit back and wait. So you might start some program, you might do something, your interest might change. So deferment doesn't necessarily guarantee that those students would come. Cancellations are not that much. The survey showed 10% cancellation. So it was mainly deferment and delay or so, more than cancellations or so. So students are looking sort of like worried, not knowing whether they should proceed with their plans or not. But there are also good news in some instances, because other studies have shown now that students are viewing some countries in a positive way. And they're citing places like Germany and Canada. And they say the reasons are because of the way they handled the shutdown, the way they handled international students or so. I haven't seen those studies or so, but how institutions shut down or how the shutdown was implemented also impacts decisions for students. When they know students were stranded somewhere where they didn't get enough communication to know what to do next, they didn't get much support and so on. So that has impacted that. There's also a study that was done by Mamuleho, who used to be at the World Bank or so, on just a quick like Google search. What does Google search look like when you're searching for study abroad? And his report is that Google searches for study abroad has plummeted, but online studies have gone up. And then he also looked at searches for destinations, countries, US, Canada, and UK. And for those, again, the figures had dropped. So there is impact one way or another in terms of how people are viewing that. But as I say, the jury is out. We'll see. It's hard to really predict with precision. And especially now that we're on the summer break. So it will be a different story in fall, in September, when school resumes.
Yeah, thank you. I think right now we talk a lot about international students. The definition probably more like degree students who study in the US for 4 years or like long term. So I have another like follow-up question. It's regarding outbound program. So I think study abroad for US university is very common in past few years. Students can go overseas to study in different country for a semester or a year. So how would COVID-19 in terms of impact for the outbound program? And do you have any advice for students or parents who were thinking about sending their student going to study abroad?
From the US somewhere else?
Yeah.
Yeah, I haven't seen much being written about it, but my view is that I think we're going to see a big drop in that. I mean, outbound, even from state to state, I think we're going to see a drop in that, how different states are handling the pandemic. Very few parents, I'm sure, want to send their children, 18-year-olds and all that, to epicenters of the world, even within the US. So what more outside? So parents are feeling uncomfortable. Maybe graduate level students might still be outbound for their short-term programs or so, once travel is much easier and they feel comfortable and they're making the decision themselves. But I think for students going out somewhere, we are likely to see a big drop in that. And with a short-term semester or a year, it's very easy to defer that and continue with your life, wait a semester and see whether things improve. Unlike students that are inbound, that are coming to start a whole program. So if they're delayed by a semester, they're off track or so. So the outbound, I think, yeah, they're likely to sort of wait a little bit and then go out.
Thank you for sharing. So I have the last question. So we briefly talk about the financial stress and burdens many people will experience, which include the school as well. From a school perspective, the schools are concerned about their income and revenue. From personal perspective, many people are experiencing financial hardship right now. So, knowing that higher education can be very expensive and an investment, people are considering or reconsidering their educational plan. We cannot talk about the students who are currently admitted or thinking about deferring their enrollment studies. My next question is for people who are currently thinking about going to the studies. So with the recession that's coming up soon or anticipated to come up soon, what are your thoughts on going back to school to get an advanced degrees? Or what are some things that people should consider before deciding pursuing a higher degree next year?
Yeah, I think lots of studies by economists indicate that when there's a recession or so, then enrollments go high. But with this, with the pandemic and the recession, these are confusing times. Graduating students, are they anxious about jobs? That searches have been stopped halfway. Some professionals have been furloughed and all that. It's like, for somebody graduating, it's like, should I just continue studying or should I still be out in the market there? International students, the OTP plans have been altered. Should they go back? Should they go back and study more while waiting and then sort of continue with their life or so? It's very, very confusing. But what I can say is that when there are major changes like this, it's also an opportunity to reskill and retool, as particularly if somebody hasn't got a job. Retooling, reskilling doesn't necessarily mean doing it within the higher education system formally. You could do it from other places or so. If you can afford to study further, then you could study further or so. So I think when people think of the additional debt that they might incur, it's almost like raising the question as to whether it's worth it going back to school and adding on the debt when you're not sure about the future. So my keyword there is encouraging to study, even if you're studying at lesser cost. It's better than just being out there trying to look for jobs and you're not getting jobs, you're getting frustrated. But the main thing for me, the advice I give is that think carefully as to what is it you want to study or what skills you want to achieve. What are those new skills that will be needed in the given situation or so? In student affairs, as an example, we're offering service. Can we offer services for online students? How do we rethink our roles and how do we reskill for those new roles? Because roles are being redefined or so. So the skills that you acquired, that you're graduating from, or that you've been out there and been laid off, might not necessarily serve you as well, but they are a good foundation to start with and build. But I wouldn't say just jump into a situation and start studying like, okay, let me go do another degree or so. Really think carefully as to what is it that will be meaningful for you? What is it that will really help you as we move forward? Where are the needs? Do a needs assessment. Where are the new needs emerging? And how can I plug myself into that so that I can market myself in a different way? Instructional design is one area that's going to be coming up big time, not only for instructions in the classroom, online and all that, but even just workshops as a higher education student affairs professionals? How do you design whatever you're doing that you're going to be doing online, programming for the students online? What are the elements of design that would make me carry the message and provide the support needed or so? So studying is essential, but it should be done carefully.
Thank you, Professor. So that's end our 5 questions. So we are going to Q&A session now. So our first question here is also could be related to Professor your experience and your study in globalization is how can we get students to see the value of international education and global learning opportunity when there's so much civil unrest as in so many countries right now?
So I would say the value is more in really understanding and getting to know other people. Look at the unrests are happening because we know that they're happening because of racism. And racism happens because people don't know one another, don't understand one another, don't respect one another, don't see lives being worthwhile in the same way or so. So what we see within a country is more of a mirror reflection of what we can see between countries too. So international understanding, international relations, intercultural competencies and all that are still very critical. When you don't know the other or the other doesn't know you, then the situation becomes very problematic. You are more likely to sort of like clash than collaborate and work together. So there's still room for really promoting international understanding and intercultural understanding of one another within the country and across countries.
I think there's also a second part of the question here is asking about how do we get them focused on their home issues at hand and also see beyond it to the future? Because when we think about international student perspective, sometimes we see they live in a different country. Then they have a lot of conflict going on. So how could we really help them as if we work in a university or any kind of like student support services?
I'm not sure if I understand the question. Can you repeat it just a little?
Yeah, so the part of the question is how do we get them to focus on their home issues at hand and also go beyond to see it in the future?
Okay, yeah, so when students are out internationally, in my experience, I have found that that's when the home issues become clearer from you because you have stepped aside and you can look at them from a different angle altogether. I'll give you an example. Sometimes traveling with students and they're starting to see poverty with a different perspective in another country and so on. And it's like something needs to be done and so on. So based on how the courses and the experiences are designed, it is up to whoever is leading the course, who's guiding the students and so on to say, okay, now that we've become aware of this, what do you think is the situation in the US? Do you think there's hunger and poverty in the US? And make them aware. So what you see in another context, you also bring it into your own context as to how to address it. Or just looking at how your own situation impacts and exacerbates the situation in another country. So looking at both local and global, students being out there wanting to donate money, doing that, and encouraging them to say, when we go home, let's also be activists for that, for social justice, and make sure that even at home, we can address those similar issues. I'm not sure if I answered the question.
Awesome. And I will ask the next question, and there's a two-part to it as well. So I we talk about travel, restriction on travel being an access issue. The next question is regarding the Go Local campaign, as well as the future for a lot of the students who might be impacted due to visa. So given that limited international travel, what are your thoughts on NYU's Go Local campaign to accommodate students at global sites, which include domestically DC as well as Los Angeles? And the second part of the question is, how do you think US students may be impacted in attaining international visas and having to pivot to a domestic site?
Yeah, I think in the middle of all this challenges we face, people are coming up with creative ways of still providing access to education. So if as a parent you don't want to send your child to New York because it's still an epicenter or there are protests that are still violent then or so, then the institution is thinking of alternative ways of providing access for you by going local somewhere else and still being part of the NYU. And I think it's a temporary arrangement so that you don't miss out. It's not a matter of you'll just have to start the semester later. We agree the experience is not the same, but at least there are attempts to help with it. For the US students, in terms of going out or so, there might also be, depending on US relations with other countries or so. Fortunately, with the US passports, there are many places where students can go without necessarily having to get a visa for 90 days or so. Is it 90 days? Something like 90 days or so. But as students, you do need a student visa. And I think those countries are still open to issuing visas and letting students proceed and go there. What is important also to take note of is that what this has really raised and alerted us to is that when you go to another country to study, make sure you connect with the representative in that country. Let them know you are in the country so that should there be an emergency, it might not be a pandemic, it might be a natural disaster or something like that, at least your consulate knows that you're there and that duty is to take care of you there. And the US has got STEP to register into and so on. Things that we have been taking for granted a lot that we need to really focus on to say, I'm here, what are my resources? What are my emergency plans should there be an emergency? That's something we have to include even in orientation materials and all that. Should there be an emergency, how do we manage that risk and so on?
Thank you. And due to the time, so I'm just gonna ask one last question here. So what is the one biggest change you see in education due to this pandemic?
Realization that we need one another, we're together in it, and we need one another. So far, a lot has focused on the contributions of the hard sciences to the pandemic. And what is being ignored are the humanities contributions to dealing with the pandemic. We need one another. There's no superior and inferior sort of discipline in the whole thing. We need to understand the sociology of all that. We need to understand the education that should be provided and so on. So we all have a role to play, but at the moment prioritizing in an understandable way. Let's save lives first. But people in other disciplines should be preparing themselves to what their own contributions are and collaborate more across the world. We have learned that the virus knows no boundaries. It doesn't need a passport to cross the boundary. So we have to work collaboratively rather than create enemies across the borders or so. So that's my 2 cents on that.
Thank you, Professor. And that's all for the program for today. And Professor, thank you so much for your time and your perspective. It is a pleasure to being able to hearing from you. And thank you, Casey from Office of Global Alumni Relations to help set up this webinar.
And for everyone else, thank you for joining us today. We hope today's webinar has been informative and insightful, and we hope you can take care and stay safe.
And from my side, thank you all for your interest, for signing up to be part of this, for listening, for sending those interesting questions that makes me think more about what I do in my day-to-day life with internationalization of higher education. So thank you and goodbye. Enjoy the rest of your day, night, early morning, wherever you are. Bye.